Hi, I'm Dr. John McClanahan. I'd like to welcome everyone to our four-part series dealing with tools for staying sober, or as I like to look at it, is Now What Do I Do? Thank you and enjoy. Well, I want to welcome everybody this evening. We're going to do the fourth segment of something we've been doing all day. And again, I appreciate everybody being here. And it's a little diversion from what we usually do on Tuesday. But again, I think it certainly has some value in a continuing care setting as well. What we've been looking at, back in June, we did a couple of, I'll say episodes, like this is a sitcom, but we did a couple of segments on signs and symptoms of addiction. And I, for years, have called that, is I is or is I ain't? How do I know if it's a problem? Well, we decided to do a follow-up with that I think is a pretty significant portion of that whole presentation. And it's now what do I do? Once I decided I have a problem, how do I, where do I go from here? So we've done a number of shoots here this afternoon looking at different tools for staying sober. And we started off, just as a recap, we started off with, when I do this in a regular session, I like to do it in a couple of segments where I look at external tools for staying sober and internal tools. The last couple of hours we've looked at some external tools, things that are more environmentally, where you have to have other people involved, going to meetings, going to treatment, going to church, taking medication, something that's more of a kind of an action type of tool. Internal tools are more philosophy changes, attitude, awareness changes, things that a person can do internally, him or herself, that certainly work a whole lot better if we're doing it with the support of other people. But again, these are things that some can take a few seconds, some can take a few minutes, some might take a lifetime to actually put into place. But again, they're all very effective. So we're going to look at, in this segment, at internal tools. And I do want to pass this on in case anybody's ever watching this back in the old days. I want to thank the staff. Most are certainly gone now, but the staff on the addictions unit at Washington Adventist Hospital, which is where I got sober and where a good majority of the internal tools for staying sober, that's where this list came from. And I've used it for years and years and years, and it certainly doesn't get worn. It's still as effective today as it was 28 years ago. So anyway, what we're going to do, again, these are internal things, and I'm going to tell a couple stories and kind of illustrate a few things. Some of these you've seen over the years in other ways. But anyway, the first one on the list here, I talk often about one of the greatest tools we have in recovery is all these wonderful acronyms that we have, all these great abbreviations. And they're there for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're important. Second of all, they're extremely necessary because most of us, and I'm painting with a broad brush, I'm not labeling anybody, but most of us, our short-term memory when we first get sober ain't worth a damn. And it's so hard to remember things that are critical to maintaining sobriety. So we have all these little mind games and all these little ways to help remind ourselves. Some of them you might be familiar with. HALT and HOW are two we're going to look at. Then there's KISS, keep it simple, stupid. There's YET, when somebody says, well, that never happened to me, and somebody says, well, tack on YET, and YET stands for you're eligible too. So we have all these little reminders. Well, again, I want to talk about the two big ones. In fact, I heard somebody not too long ago, it's absolutely amazing. I was watching a show, just flipping the dial one day, and they were had a guest on. They were talking about stress management and dealing with the economy and all the things going on, and she was talking about things that she does with her clients. And one of the things that she said is so critical is I teach them to practice HALT. And I thought, wait a minute, that's our stuff, that's, but, so it can kind of work across the board. Well, again, if you're not familiar with these two, HALT is a very critical situation, and I want to explain this before anybody panics, okay? HALT stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Those are 4 things that the recovering person can't get. Now, I've had people in the past panic and look at this and go, oh my God. As an example, okay, maybe you were running late. And you came here and you didn't have a chance to eat dinner. You think, oh my God, I'm hungry. When's this thing going to be over? Okay. You're angry. You're here. Okay. Maybe you're lonely. Maybe everybody went away for vacation and you can't go because you got to be here. Maybe you're tired. It's been a long couple of weeks with the storms and everything. You might have somebody look at that and go, good Lord, I'm 4 for 4. HALT is not the situation or the occurrence, it's the frequency. It's when these things start to take on a life of their own. If you look at the basic definition of addiction, the word addiction comes from a Latin word addictus that means all-consuming. When we put in anything that takes precedence over a situation, it can certainly be a drug of choice. It could be a feeling. Fear can be so paralyzing. Fear is a normal emotion. Keeps us from playing in traffic and doing stuff like that. But also it can paralyze a person if it takes over. So we're not talking about the occurrence of these things. We're talking about the frequency. And it doesn't just have to be a physical hunger. It can be a spiritual hunger. It can be an emotional hunger. Anything that's an emptiness certainly could be considered creating a hunger. Anger, I always look at is, anger kind of holds what I call an emotion position. Technically, you could put any of the usual cast of characters in here. Resentment, fear, self-pity. Anger's in there for 2 very important reasons. One I think is realistic, one I made up. But anger is there because it's the number 1 emotion we see in any illness. Nobody's excited to find out they're sick. It doesn't have to be a life-threatening illness. You could be getting ready to go on vacation and you wake up and you've got the flu. It's a pretty good chance you're going to be a little pissed because of that. Anger is a normal emotion in this process. I also look at anger, fits in there really well, because if you put any other emotion in there, it wouldn't spell HALT, okay? So you kind of, you have to kind of look at it in terms of, put resentment in there and you ain't got a whole lot of anything there. So anyway, HALT is a very critical piece. The lonely part, I think a lot of times people misinterpret lonely. Very often people say, well, I'm around a whole lot of people, I'm not lonely. Lonely is an internal feeling. Being alone is an external environment thing. You can be in a stadium full of 50, 60, 100,000 people and be the loneliest person on the planet. Or you can be completely by yourself and be perfectly happy. So alone and lonely are not the same thing. One's an external environment, one's an internal environment. The tired part isn't, it's been a busy day, I've had all of us, and hopefully we have it more times than not, have that experience of it's a good tired. It's been a busy day, I'm exhausted, but it's a good tired. This tired is where everything starts to revolve around exhaustion. And if you've ever been with me when we've done sessions on stress management, and we talk about the stages of stress, 2 are normal, 1 is not. The first stage of stress is alarm. It's where the body gets ready to do what we call fight or flight. The second stage is resistance. That's where the body's cooling back down. It's made a decision and followed through. The third stage is when the person is bouncing back and forth between those 2, and eventually exhaustion is the final stage. So again, we're not talking about, boy, I'm tired, what a day I've had. This is an all-encompassing kind of thing. So it's not just the occurrence, it's the frequency, the pattern. I like to focus on how, in fact, we're going to do a whole session here in a couple of weeks dealing with How, because that's one of my favorite ones. It got kind of pushed to the side a number of years ago, but it's starting to show itself in treatment and meetings again now. It's kind of the second cousin to HALT. If somebody says, how do you get sober? How are you staying sober? How's it work for you? How do I do this? HOW stands for honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. And those are the three critical pieces to this. Okay? They're in that order for a good reason. Okay? When we talk about honesty, we're talking about getting honest with ourselves. Okay? Let me put a little quick thing up here. Some of you have seen this before. And again, pardon my artwork. If you look at recovery as an archway, okay, every archway has two cornerstones that hold it in place. Okay? For us, honesty and humility are the two cornerstones. Honesty is getting honest with us. Humility is getting honest with everybody else. You can't do that until you do this. So this is getting honest with myself. First step of a 12-step program talks about we admitted we were powerless over whatever. You know, not everybody else and you guys, it's we, it's me too. So it's getting honest with us. So HALT and HOW are very, very critical components. And again, they're great little abbreviations to help us remember what we need to do. Like I said, I'm going to do a brief overview of these. Some I'll spend a little bit of time with, some not so much. But the second one, we talk about fill the hole. We have to find something to fill the void. Anytime you take something away, a lot of you know the old phrase and statement about, you know, nature abhors a vacuum. You take something away, she's going to find a way to fill it. And it may not be with what you want, or it may not be with what you need. So we have to find a way to fill that hole. We do a session or two in group where we compare the grief process to early recovery. And people for years used to think I was comparing apples and oranges because it was kind of a, you know, how can you look at early recovery as a loss? Anytime you take something away that created or occupied a large part of a person's time, you create a vacuum. You got to fill that hole. I've had people in the past say, yeah, well, I didn't drink or use or gamble 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't have to. Some of us end up there, some of us don't. If you're in an active stage of addiction, you don't have to have it in your hand 24 hours a day. I'm always of the mind that anybody in active use is always in the state of three. We're either using, getting overusing, or getting ready for the next use. There's not a lot of wiggle room for work, family, career, church, hobbies, whatever it might be. We have to fill that void because if we don't, we know what's going to go back into the situation here. We also have to find something that's very kind of a foreign term to people, especially early in recovery, and certainly was for me too. We have to find some balance. And balance is one of those kind of strange things that, geez, if I knew anything about balance, I wouldn't be here. That's kind of the hallmark of addiction. If one's good, 20's even better. Or if somebody says a little, that means a lot. So it's about finding balance. Well, one of the things that we have to do is we have to fill the hole, but we have to be careful. I had a guy a number of years ago, and some of you know this story, and I'm not poking fun or anything, but it's just a clear example of the hallmark of addiction is excess. Again, if one's good, two's better. I remember when I first got sober, a guy in a meeting came up to me and said, son, you need to find a hobby. And I very quickly responded to him, well, you just took my hobby away. And I knew what he meant, but I had this idea if one hobby was good, two would be even better. And wow, a three, you know. I had a guy in the Saturday noon group a number of years ago that was retired, had just gotten out of inpatient, was in his late 70s, early 80s, and he decided he was going to follow his treatment plan to the letter. He wasn't going to wiggle at all because I don't know if I've got 5 years left on earth or 5 minutes, but I know I'm not living it this way anymore. I'm going to do whatever it takes. Well, part of, and we talked about this in an earlier segment, one of the things that was on his treatment plan, and on a lot of people's, is 90 meetings in 90 days. Well, he looked at that and said, well, I'm certainly going to do that. I'm retired. I got the time. So he started going to a meeting every day. A couple weeks into recovery, he's making small talk, meeting before the meeting. And he's talking to everybody, and he said, I really enjoy going to meetings. He said, in fact, I go to meetings every night. He said, and I found out there's a noon meeting every day at the church up the street from me. And I've got the time, and I love going to meetings, so I'm going to that now too. And he said, kind of, tongue in cheek, he said, and if I go to 180 meetings in 90 days, I'll get sober twice as fast. Well, people kind of chuckled and said, you better be. He says, I'm just kidding. Well, a couple weeks later, he comes back into, he's in group every Saturday. And a couple weeks later, he said something to somebody about, there's a 6 o'clock in the morning meeting right up the street from me. And it's called Early Birds. And I went and I love it. And I've got the time. Hey, 270 meetings in 90 days. I'll get sober 3 times as fast. What happened was he got sick and tired of going to meetings, and he stopped, and he disappeared, and I never heard another word from him. We fill the hole, but use some balance and some discretion, okay? I always like to look at early recovery as planting a tree. When you plant a tree, you dig a hole, and you've got that hole, and you put the tree in the hole and you're looking at it, and maybe you tell yourself, well, that doesn't really look that good there, or it's going to grow really fast and knock out the second story windows, so I better go put it somewhere else. So you go and plant it someplace else. Well, the job's not done until you fill that first hole in. And I always tell folks, unless you're really unusual, most people don't dig a hole by taking a shovel full of dirt, walking over here, dumping it on this side of the yard, coming back, getting another shovel full of dirt. Okay? When you go to fill the hole up, what's the easiest thing to put in the hole? The dirt we just took out. It's sitting right there. Early in recovery, if people say my life was a mess when I was using, I've stopped. It's still a mess. Why did I stop using? It's the worst thing in the world we can tell ourselves, but at the time it makes all the sense in the world. If everybody said my drinking was a problem, my drug use was a problem, if you don't stop gambling and everything, and I stopped and my life is still a mess, obviously that wasn't the problem. And then we say, but I've learned something. This time I'm going to control it. Okay? I'm going to put a little bit, just, one. And some of you know the rest of this story. And I know the science and the reason why. I have never in my life been able to dig a hole, put the same dirt back in it, and fill up the hole. It just doesn't work that way. I know it settles different in air pockets and that kind of. So when somebody says, I'm just going to put a little back in, that'll take the edge off, it's like it's magic dirt. Okay? The more dirt I'm putting in the hole, the faster it's digging. So no matter what I'm putting in, it's like a dog chasing their tail. More needs more needs more. So we have to learn to fill that void, but fill it in a healthy, reasonable way. Okay? Another one that's on the list is this idea of setting priorities. First things first. This is something you hear in meetings all the time. You see it on the wall and on posters and that kind of thing. First things first. There's an old saying, Father Martin used to always mention this, if sobriety's not first, nothing's second. That has to be the priority. Okay? Doesn't mean everything else takes a back seat. Again, we have to find that balance somehow, but sobriety has to be the main focus. Some of you know one of my other pet peeves in recovery is this word here. I hate this word. We all use it. It's common slang and vernacular for relapse. When somebody talks about they slipped, okay? And I say it too. I have to catch myself every so often, and it's do as I say, not as I do. And I hate that word because slip is an accident. Okay? Return to active use is not an accident. It's a subconscious setup. It's a process. In fact, very often in relapse groups, we talk about relapse is not an event. It's not a thing. Every so often people will still refer to it in the present tense. Somebody will say, well, I relapsed last night, or I relapsed over the weekend. The person didn't relapse last night, they used. Relapse is all the junk that came before it that set that need into motion for whatever reason. So it's a process, not an event. It's not an accident. I can guarantee right now, there's not one of you sitting here that when you leave, and there's still a couple of, because of all the rain, there's still a couple muddy spots and slick spots and everything. I can guarantee there's not one of you who's sitting here thinking, when this is over, I'm going to go outside, I'm going to find that mud puddle, I'm going to step in it, and I'm going to slip and fall right on my can. Okay? If you walk out and you don't see it and you slip and fall, that's an accident. The other is a premeditated thing. Okay? It's a conscious, you have an accident in the car. That's just that. It's a chance situation. It's not you pre-calculating the next green Toyota I see. That's it. Okay? Slip is, and relapse is not an accident. This denotes, no choice, just happened. It's another great little acronym. If you want to use the word slip, use it for what it really means. Not use, not an accident. Sobriety loses or lost its priority. All of a sudden, it's not if you use it in that term, absolutely it's a slip. But in the terms and the sense we use it in, it's not an accident. It's not I don't know where it came from, it just happened. Sometimes it seems to hit out of nowhere, but when you look back, we can see it coming. It's like, oh my God, I stopped doing this, I started doing that. I'm not using yet, but you can see the pattern. Okay, so sobriety is the priority. Okay, that comes first. Okay. Change old routines. This is another, it's a great we got thousands and thousands of cliches in recovery. And they're there because they're true. They're there because they're important. Some of you might be familiar with the old adage about if you go to the barber shop often enough, sooner or later you're going to get a haircut. So many times people will put themselves, sobriety is not a tug of war. It's not a let me put myself in the most difficult situation and watch me work. Watch me stay sober. I can handle this. Problem is, 9 times out of 10, you might be able to handle that. It's that one time. It's that one time that all bets are off. Change routines. Okay? I had a patient a number of years ago to show you how it became a tug-of-war thing. This was years ago when I still worked at the hospital. And his name was Ed, and Ed was a cocaine addict. And Ed had pretty much lost everything. Lost his job, lost his savings, lost his house, lost his family. His wife and 2 children moved out. Well, one day he decided he was going to try to get sober. Came into the hospital program, went through inpatient at the time, then went into outpatient, and started doing aftercare, doing continuing care. And a couple months into his recovery, he came in one night and he said, I got really good news. He said, things are really starting to work well. He said, my wife and my 2 daughters are back. He said, Mom and Dad said we could live with them until we found another place, but I had to stay clean. That was the main thing. I got another job. He said, things are really, he said, this sobriety thing is wonderful. Okay? Things were going along pretty well. And one Friday, the company he worked for had a policy, especially during nice weather in the spring and the summer, if everything was caught up, they could do a half a day. So it was a nice Friday, it was a gorgeous day outside, got the world by the tail, decides this would be a great time to test my resolve. So he drives to Baltimore, which is where he used to get his supply, and He goes to this open air market where he would buy and pulls in a parking lot across the street. And he's watching business. And it's brisk. It's just going on. Well, the dealer that he always dealt with, is the guy on the corner. And there's a lull in business. And he looks up and he sees Ed sitting in the car. And he kind of waves to him and come on over. And Ed goes, nah, kind of, hand gestures. No, I'm good. Well, business picks up and Ed's sitting there. Another lull in the action. And the guy looks, Ed's still sitting there. And he's, come on over. Well, now I think the dealer was probably getting a little leery about, why is this former client of mine, why is he watching me? So he comes over and tells Ed, he said, hey, what are you doing? He goes, I'm just sitting here. Do you want anything? He goes, no. He said, if it's money, he said, you were always good for it. I'll front you a little something. No, I don't do that stuff anymore. And the guy looked at him like he was nuts and walked away. And business picks up and Ed goes, oh, I'm satisfied, drives away. A couple weeks later, same situation. It's a nice day. I think I'll go to Baltimore. Pulls in the same spot. And a dealer looks over and it kind of gives him the, what? Well, break in the action, and the guy comes over because now he's really nervous because now he's there again. And he said, what are you doing here, man? And he said, I'm watching. He said, I'm kind of testing myself. And the dealer had more sense than Ed. He looked at Ed and he said, you're nuts. Get out of here. You don't need to be here. And he went back and started doing business. Well, a couple minutes later, Ed leaves. A couple weeks later, the bottom dropped out. The company that he went to work for, ran into some financial difficulty. And everybody unfortunately knows the old adage of, last hired, first fired. Ed got fired. He lost his job. They were cutting back. He gets on the phone outside. This is before I had cell phones. He gets on the pay phone and he calls his wife and says, honey, I got bad news. I just lost my job. Click. And he goes, I don't know what, maybe, what that was all about. So he goes home. She had already told his mother what had happened. He pulls up in front of the house and his clothes are sitting in Safeway luggage, sitting in grocery bags, sitting on the porch with a note, we're sorry, God love you, and good luck. Mom, you're out. And the wife had left a note also, we're gone. Well, Ed didn't even have a chance to explain. It's got nothing to do with me using. I'm fine. He got this bright idea. Now I'm really going to test my resolve. He drives up to Baltimore and disappeared for 3 months. It was just, I can handle this. Watch me work. Oh my God. Okay? Old routines can suck us right back in. It's not a tug of war. Now that doesn't mean you can't go to ball games, you can't go to parties, to dances, to clubs, to whatever you were doing before. Bill Wilson, one of the co-founders of AA, used to always talk about, in situations like that, check your motives. If your motive is to be somewhere to enjoy the game, or your motive is to be there to enjoy the music or the people, you're fine. If your motive, the only reason to be at that facility was to get drunk, you got no business going back. To give yourself some time. Okay, so be careful of those old routines. Be good to yourself. This is one that I think, very often, and we did some work a couple weeks ago on an 8th and a 9th step, and had talked a little bit about the way you can kind of break this down if you're doing a list of people we need to make amends to. And we talked about family, friends, creditors, the deceased. How do you make amends to somebody who's gone? And then I said there's a 5th category that I'm going to leave blank, and I want to see how many people know what that is. Well, most people came up. That 5th category is yourself. Very often we think, well, if I make amends to everybody else, we got to make amends to us too. And we do that very simply by staying sober every day. We kind of are taking care of that. But early on, if you've ever done this little piece, you certainly, again, know my artwork and my little brain guy. Okay? The first part of the brain that gets knocked offline through use, not talking about addiction, just use, is the part of the brain that controls reason and judgment, short-term memory, also houses sense of self. How do you feel about yourself? Can you stand what you're looking at? And we've talked before, positive self things like self-worth, self-respect, self-esteem, self-confidence, they get shoved to the side and get replaced very quickly by negative self things. Self-pity, self-criticism, self-centeredness, okay? The reason this is important, the first part of the brain that gets knocked offline is the last part that comes back online. So again, what I need the most of is what I'm going to have the least of. Most of our sense of self, we've talked about this a number of times. A lot of us, when we first came into meetings or treatment or wherever, or went back to church or whatever we were doing, had this feeling in the back of our minds, if they knew the real me, they wouldn't let me sit in here. I mention often one of my favorite lines from Groucho Marx. He used to talk about, I don't know if I'd want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member. Well, I think a lot of us, when we first come into recovery, have that same, you got no idea who you're dealing with now. Our sense of self is so bad. Do something for yourself. Be good to yourself once in a while. We deserve that. And again, very often by staying sober every day, we're doing that. Okay? We need to remind ourselves that addiction is an ongoing illness. That's another internal tool. There's no cure for addiction. It's a chronic illness. I've been sober a long time, but I'm still alcoholic. I'll die alcoholic. I can't change that. What I have control over is whether I'm a sober one or not. We even have changed, and you can tell how long somebody's been sober by how they refer to themselves. People who've been sober since the dark ages, the real old timers, you'll hear them talk about they're a recovered alcoholic or they're a recovered addict. Okay? Those of us who've been sober a little bit more recent than that, we talk about being recovering people. I'm not a recovered anything. Recovered, that little ending, ED, means done. I'm finished. It's in the past. I'm cured. I'm fixed. Recovering means I'm a work in progress. I'm better today than I was yesterday. I'm a whole lot better today than I was a year ago. And I'll be a whole lot better tomorrow than I am right now. It's an ongoing thing. So it's not a recovered thing. We always are one, but we can be sober ones. So if we remind ourselves of this, we stand a good chance of not letting that get in the way. One of the most important ones, remember your last use. Remember your last drunk, your last use, your last whatever, last episode. You've heard me in relapse groups before talk about more return to active use occurs when things are going well. The brain has, it's a corny old thing, but you'll hear people talk about this too. The brain has a built-in forgetter. Basically, that what they're saying is the brain remembers pleasure. It doesn't remember pain. As an example, okay, if I'm standing here and we've got a great example for a hot day like this, if I've got a roaring fire going on in the fireplace and I'm standing right next to it, okay, doesn't take a lot to remind me it's warm. I can feel it, I can see it, I can smell it, I can hear it. Okay? So I'm pretty close to the event. If I get over here, I can still see it, I can smell it, I can maybe hear it. The heat might not be as intense. If I get over here, it's a whole lot. If I get out in the parking lot, I might not be able to see it, smell it, feel it, hear it. Okay? I'm just liable to forget it's in there. Okay? I know this might sound a little over the top for people, but I'm a firm believer in it doesn't take much for you to be reminded of how warm it is when your ass is still on fire. Okay? I have never seen a person yet come out of court going, hot dog, that was a lot of fun. I can't wait to go back and do that again. You always hear, man, I ain't never doing that again. You couldn't pay me to go back in. When a person says that, it's not that I don't believe them because they're still on fire. But the further you get away from the event, that was then. To almost where it's like an out-of-body experience. That was somebody else's life you were watching. More return to active use occurs when things are going well. More thinking about returning to active use might occur when it's right about to hit the fan. But in sobriety, what we learn to do is dig down deep and pull up and say, you know what? If I can't handle what's going on sober, how am I going to handle it drunk? I think I need to call somebody or say a prayer or do whatever we need to do. So more return to active use occurs when things are going well, because there's that how bad could it be. So remember what got you here. I tell folks, and I don't care, it's a matter of degree. When people, I used to do family work all the time, and one of the things I used to hear all the time, and I hated it, you'd hear people say, well, you know, I didn't expect her to get well, or I knew he was going to go back out. They haven't hit their bottom yet. Bottom is a relative term. Bottom is as bad as it has to be. I've been doing this a long time, and I've had people that have had near-death experiences that will come out of the hospital and kind of go, phew, that was a close one. I need to think about this, and they'll go drink. I've had people literally, not to be corny, break a nail and say, oh my God, my life's out of control, it's unmanageable, and it takes whatever it takes. And anytime somebody says, well, I've hit bottom and that's it, bottom has a very important secret. Bottom has a trap door. And every time we reach bottom, the person bounces around a little bit and goes, well, that ain't so bad. I ain't dead yet. This is as bad as it's going to be. And they go back out, and that door opens, and down they fall to the next level. And they bounce around. Okay, bottom is a very relative term. We do a session, an exercise from time to time, where I have people write out your last day using. Kind of a day in the life, what got you here? And it's one of the few exercises, because when we do exercises in group, I usually have people, I take volunteers and that kind of. With this exercise, I ask if everybody please would read what they came up with. And we go around the room, and depending on the size of the group, we might, take a couple minutes, might take a half hour, might take, whatever. And if I have somebody that I know is doing the identify out type of thing, I'm not like them, I'll ask the question, you heard a little snippet, a little snapshot of a day in the life. Is there anybody in here who's worse than you? And you'll see people kind of looking around, and nobody's going to be there. It's like, oh, come on, we're all family in here. Come on, anybody in here worse than you? Finally, there'll be one poor soul, and you'll see them, and it happens every time as they're raising their finger. And I tell them, because they'll say, yeah, I said, now I want you to point to that person. Oh, I ain't done. I said, go ahead and point to that. And you'll see them start to do this. And I said, I don't want any sissy point. I don't want this. I want you to own it. And as that finger's going up, you'll see the person either say it out loud or mouth the words, I'm sorry. And now that person's sitting there, or I always laugh and tell people, use the Disney point. It's 2 fingers. 1 finger's rude. Okay, use 2 fingers. Okay? See, I got my skill set for going to work down there. I can do that. And have a magical day. I'm ready. That's it. And this is my retirement film. And after so use the polite point. And as soon as somebody does that, and the roof doesn't cave in and nobody gets punched, all of a sudden you start seeing people doing this, and fingers are pointing everywhere. And I'll ask now, are you pointing at somebody? Is there somebody in here worse than you? Uh-huh. Look around. Somebody pointing at you? Oh my God. It's all relative. When somebody says, I'm not as bad as him or her, remember, he or she wasn't as bad as him or her at one time either. It's that whole idea of yet, okay? It's all relative. If you remember what got you here, everybody in here knows the old saying about history that we don't learn from, we're doomed to repeat. I don't think in any situation is it more true than in recovery. And I think I can make this statement in a pretty bold way without stepping out on a limb. I don't think there's anybody in here right now who's here because you got nothing better to do on a Tuesday night. Something happened. Something got us here. Wednesday morning, Thursday night, Saturday. Okay? Something happened. It's just a matter of degree. And if you don't want it to happen again, remember what got us here in the first place. Okay? One of my favorite ones, and I have another little story, and then we'll do these last three fairly quickly. I love this line because people don't talk this way anymore. There's a line in AA's big book that talks about one of the things you need to do your first year of sobriety: avoid emotional entanglements. And we don't talk that way. It's like, what the hell does that mean? That sounds like a horrible thing, okay? Avoid emotional entanglements. Okay? Basically, it means don't make major changes. I'm a firm believer in this too, and I get flack for this all the time, but I've got big shoulders and I'll deal with this. A lot of treatment programs, and it's what works for them. They have a stand-in policy. Okay, so you're coming in to get clean and sober. Okay, you're going to stop smoking. You're going to get rid of this, get rid of that. For a lot of people, that can be too much too soon. I've seen too many people say, well, I'm 3 weeks into recovery. Never thought I'd get that opiate use under control, but things are going along pretty well. I'm feeling comfortable. It's a good time to stop smoking, quit cussing, lose 50 pounds, build a new house, find a new career, get a new family, and a week later they're sitting in rehab going, what the hell happened? It's too much too soon. Okay? The catch-22, we're told avoid major changes. The odd, ironic thing about this, the word sobriety comes from a word that means total change. So the very thing we're told to avoid. So basically what they're saying is you're going to get enough of it, don't add to it. Okay? Avoid emotional entanglements. We were doing a version of this in a treatment session years and years ago. Again, I was still at the hospital. And we were talking about this idea of emotional entanglements. And basically what's saying is, you don't have to be a hermit. You can date and you can go out. Just don't make a commitment, okay? Because, most relationships, the best of times it's 50-50. Well, if you're still trying to figure out who you are, what are you bringing to the table? So you got to take care of you first. One night, I'm home, had just left group, and the phone rings. It's about 11:30, and I'm watching the news. And of course, when the phone rings, it's not somebody telling you won the lottery, or it's got to be something that's not good. And I'm human, so part of me was like, I really don't want to answer the phone, but so I do. It was perfect timing. So, hello. It's all good. So anyway, the phone rings, and I answer it, and I said, hello. And this very angry female voice is on the other end of the phone. Is this John McClanahan? Who wants to know? Yes, ma'am. Is this Dr. John McClanahan? Well, there might be more than one in the country. I'm thinking, yes, ma'am. Is this Dr. McClanahan from Washington Adventist Hospital? Yeah, that would be me. Are you the SOB that told my husband to leave me? Oh, no, ma'am, that wasn't me. I said, what are you talking about? He walks in and says, Doc said I gotta go. And it's like, that's not what I said. If you're not involved in a relationship, don't get into a commitment. Take care of you first. If you are one, it ain't your get out of jail free card. So you gotta be real careful with that. So I always wondered whatever happened to I haven't gotten any phone calls, and that was 20-something years ago. So I'm sure they're fine. The next one is another big one, and we talked about this in the previous segment when we were talking about medications that we can use to turn down cravings and that type of thing. Sobriety is an all or nothing process when we talk about mood-altering substances. Again, the alcoholic can't say, well, I'm not going to drink anymore, but never done cocaine, how bad could that be? Or the heroin user can't say, well, drinking's not going to. All drugs of choice impact this part of the brain first, and housed in there also is reason and judgment. and reason and judgment are the two things that allow us to say no. That's what rational thought is all about. So whatever drug of choice you use, I've got a good friend, he's a cocaine addict, and he can stay clean for a while, and he just has never made the connection of, every time I drink, next thing I find myself going off to get high and I disappear for 3 or 4 days. The drinking's not the problem. Well, if you're putting to sleep the part of the brain that's telling you no, it doesn't matter what your drug of choice is. Okay? As an example, I want you to think for just a minute what your favorite food is. I don't care what it is. Okay? And you're starving to death and you can't get it. I will guarantee you peanut butter and jelly will fill the hole. Might not be what you're looking for, it might not be what you want, but it'll take care of the hunger. So a person might say, well, it ain't cocaine, but phew, it ain't bad. You're filling the hole. The brain doesn't care. Receptors open, we put something in, and they say thank you very much, and they close. That's the way it works. It's as simple as that. Okay? We were talking in the last segment also, please, and as a reminder, if you're taking a medication for depression, bipolar disorder, some other issue, please, please don't let people in recovery tell you you're not sober. I still hear it. It's a little better today than it used to be, but I would hear people just berated in meetings, maybe before a group, that kind of thing. Not very often, because folks I work with don't have that kind of attitude. But I know it's all or nothing. But when we talk about that, we're talking about mood-altering substances. Medications that we use to treat depression, bipolar disorder, again, anxiety disorder, whatever it might be, those aren't mood-altering. They're mood levelers. To me, telling somebody, well, you're in recovery now, you can't take that Paxil anymore. You got to get rid of that Effexor. You're not in recovery. To me, that's like telling somebody that's diabetic, welcome to the club, you're in recovery, and if you want to stay, you got to stop taking your insulin. That's nonsense. I'd mentioned in the last segment also, one of the last pieces of literature that Bill Wilson wrote, one of the co-founders of AA, I think was probably his most brilliant. It deals with recovery and other medications. And not once in that little pamphlet does he talk about, you can't do this. Other people since him have twisted it to their own concerns and interpretation. He always, in that little pamphlet, talks about people on other medications. You're still in recovery. In fact, if you need to take your antidepressant to be able to get out of bed to go to a meeting, what's wrong with that? You're not getting high taking Zoloft. You're not getting high taking Effexor. You're getting balanced. So it's avoid mood-altering drugs, not everything. Okay, so again, I mentioned in the last segment too, if somebody says that you're not in recovery, thank them for their concern and keep doing what you're doing, because you're fine. Okay? They're not a pharmacist. They're not a doctor. If they have that concern and that feeling, that's perfectly, they're entitled to their opinion. But you are still in recovery. You are still sober. Last two real quick, and another bumper sticker philosophy, but it works very well, and that's one day at a time. We had started this whole thing a couple of hours ago talking about no matter what technique we choose to maintain sobriety, whether it's inpatient, outpatient, church, medication, all the above, it still starts with just for today. I can't focus on, am I still going to be sober 10 years from now? Am I going to be sober a week from now? If I'm focused on whether I'm going to be sober down the road, I'm not focused on being sober now. Again, I'd mentioned in the previous segment too, Father Martin used to talk about this all the time. If you take care of today's sobriety, it's a good possibility you just bought tomorrow's. And I kind of like to look at it in maybe another little way, but If I do today what I did yesterday, it's a pretty good chance I'll be okay the rest of the day. And if I do tomorrow what I'm doing right now, it's a pretty good chance I got one more day there too. But I don't get cocky and say, well, I've been sober for a long time, so that guarantees I'm going to be sober down. The only guarantee I've got is right this minute. And I tell folks all the time, again, I've been sober a long time, but I'm one drink away from being the new guy. All I got to do is forget. And the only difference between me and somebody that's coming in with 24 hours is I started before them. That's the only difference. I still have to do all the things that I'm told to do, all the things that I did 28 years ago. I have to keep doing those things, because if I don't, and if I'm lucky to come back, I'll be the new guy. But I don't want to tempt that. It's very simple. Just stay sober today. We talk often about relapse being a process, not an event. I think sometimes we forget that sobriety is a process also. That's not a, okay, been there, done that. Okay? It's a living, breathing, ongoing process as well. Okay? That's why we talk about being recovering, folks. The last one I wanted to mention, and this is a critical one, because this is so hard for us to do. And again, I'm painting with that broad brush. Is be patient. I've mentioned in a number of other settings and situations. There's two words in the addict's vocabulary that he or she hates to hear. One is no, and worse than that is wait. When's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? It's going to happen. You know, you hear people, if I hear one more time, it happens in God's time, not mine. I'm going to puke. Well, then puke, because that's the way it is. This doesn't happen in my time. It happens the way it's supposed to happen, whatever causes that. All I know is I can interfere with how it's happening and screw it all up. I've mentioned before as well that addicts are notorious for asking for help, asking for advice, taking that advice, putting their own spin on it, screwing it all up, and then blaming everybody for giving us really lousy advice. Okay? It takes as long as it takes. Okay? Be patient. One last example, and I hope this doesn't happen to anybody. As you're leaving here in a little bit and you walk into your car, if you're not right here on the porch, if you step off the side of the porch, there's a little landing. If you step down wrong, suppose you step off that and you break your ankle. Okay? A couple of things are going to happen. Hopefully I don't get sued. Hopefully you don't come in and punch me. But one thing for sure is it's going to need some attention. And depending on how hard you hurt it, you might need to bandage it up. You might need a splint. You might need surgery. You might need pins, that kind of. And it's going to take time. You're definitely going to need rehab and physical therapy. The reason I mentioned that little disaster took 4 seconds to happen. And it's going to take days and weeks and months to heal itself. We'll take something that took decades for some of us to unfold and think we're going to fix it this weekend. It's a start, and we have to keep doing what we're doing. Okay? We have to be patient. Okay? I want to thank everybody for being here this evening, earlier during the day as we've been doing this. And I always like to end things like this in a very special way, special to me. Bill Wilson, again, one of the co-founders of AA, used to always end meetings back in the old days, back in the 30s and early 40s, when meetings were still being held in his living room in Manhattan. And he used to always tell people, thanks for being here, and thanks for helping me stay sober one more day. And I read that years ago, and I thought, you know what? I like that. I don't think he'd mind. I'm going to steal that. And I'd like to end with that. Thanks for being here, and thanks for helping me stay sober one more day. Keep up the good work, and see you real soon. Enjoy. Thank you.